So what we are covering today, as you must have seen, is the idea of freedom as explored by a specific social movement. One of the the most important, I would say, social movement in India today, which is the Dalit movement, which has a history going back to colonial times, but has gathered momentum more recently in the last few decades, and has sort of flowered into something of a very, into a multi-dimensional kind of force. So you have literary expression, which is primarily what we are looking at here, but of course literary expression which is never far removed from the political questions, the questions of identity and existence, etc. But the Dalit movement has also gone off in many other directions. For instance, there are now political parties which are based in Dalit identity, although they try to be more, they are not restricted in terms of membership to Dalits, but they have their beginning in Dalit ideology. So that's the background to this. We've already looked at Ambedkar's writings. And as these readings very clearly demonstrate, some of the, Ambedkar is always at the, very central to this movement, a figure of inspiration, and indeed very almost deified in some social context. But it's also there is, this range of readings also gives a sense of the divergences of opinion that prevail within the movement, and so that's what we will try to capture through the presentations today, which are by Neela, E, and Vicky, right? So we will go according to. See, the readings are from two different texts. Let me just introduce them. The latter set of readings from 5-6 onwards are from a very old anthology called Poisoned Bread, which was one of the first anthologies to come out in English of Dalit writings. This came out in the early 90s, and it was basically Marathi Dalit writing. This Marathi is the language of the province of Maharashtra, which is the western province of which the capital is Mumbai. So that's the region. And Ambedkar comes from that place, that state. And so it is the, the movement had in some ways its beginnings in that state. So the first anthology basically concentrates on Dalit writing from Maharashtra, and when it came out in the early 90s, it really opened up a completely new world, as it were, to the rest of India, who were not all that aware of this. The second set, that is the top 4 readings, are from a more recent anthology, which is a 2-volume anthology, very, very substantial volumes, each running into 600 pages or so, of Dalit writings from the 4 South Indian states of Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka, which are 4 different languages. So 2 languages in each volume, and this set of readings is from the first volume, and they are from Tamil and Malayalam writings, these set of readings. There are also the Kannada and Telugu, which is a separate volume, which is not represented here. And now there is a kind of explosion of Dalit writing everywhere. Suddenly, even in Bengal, which is usually considered a place which is not touched by caste movements at all. So everywhere people say Bengal has no caste and so on. This kind of thing. But even from Bengal, recently, an anthology of Dalit writing from Bengal has arrived. So you can imagine, Gujarati, Hindi, Bengali, every all Indian languages are now sort of this is kind of flowering. Not only flowering of new writing, but also in the wake of this excitement, discovery of old writings which were never acknowledged and so on. So these kinds of developments. And it's within the literary field a very very dynamic sort of moment which the Dalit writing brought to the to literature as a field of study and as a practice. And of course, the writing is also literature, but also criticism. So criticism which reflects back on Dalit literature, but also criticism that is addressed to the shortcomings, the casteist assumptions of mainstream literature, Hindu Brahminical literature or whatever it is that is already prevalent, the dominant. There are also writings which go into social questions and so on. So in Dalit writing, there is a resistance to this separation of genres. There is, literature, poetry is only poetry and stories and so on. Something else, criticism is this and so on. There is a resistance to that. And a tendency to have all of them, different types of writings. In fact, one of these readings, this writer suggests to the Dalit writers the example of new journalism in America, saying, that's a good model for Dalits to follow because it allows individual expression, because it's a very, there's kind of authored style. Norman Mailer and people like that, they are very much creative in a way, expressive of the author's persona, but at the same time they are dealing with topical issues and so on. So he recommends that kind of thing. So it shows that Dalit writing is autobiographies and so on. They're experimenting with form and in some ways challenging these established genre references in writing in general, right? And of course, the question of freedom, which we will of course continue to pursue through these writings. So who will go first? You will? Okay. He is presenting on Yesudasan towards a prologue to Dalit studies.
Good afternoon. Today I'm going to present the paper Towards a Prologue to Dalit Study, which is written by Yesudasan and edited by Naya. In his No Alphabet Inside, New Dalit Writing from South India Dossier, edited by Naya. He points out the Dalit experience is the most inhuman exploitation, and is now mature enough to be studied because there is a growing awareness of Savannah supremacy. Savannah supremacy, known as the Varna system, which include four castes. They are Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Sudra. It is an attempt to retrieve a lost pride and the opportunity to redefine the sense of self, as well as the identity. And he said the Dalit study has to be able to locate the role of Dalit in history and in the future. And because the invisibility and the powerlessness will haunt Dalit destiny, and Dalit will have nothing but humiliation. So it's very important to look for the representation and the subjectivity of Dalit and find a place in history and to shape their future. And it's important to, this is the attempt of and then he employed Foucault's idea of knowledge, which is produced by passing through epistemological procedures of social control. And he concluded the oppressed Dalit has already been silenced and excluded. So this Dalit study is to counter the hegemonic power, to facilitate the erosion of Dalit voice and truth. So, and eventually Dalit can develop their discourse. And this study's objectives, the goals, are to retrieve Dalit tradition, the form of knowledge, and to subject them to an analysis and interpretation, therefore to examine the cause of Dalit backwardness and the other issues, so they could develop a perspective on the past, present, and future in order to formulate Dalit concept for critical interpretation. And he believed the emergence of new science, the attitude of a new science, which met the context, the social and historical context, audible and visible. So it's very important to study the everyday life of everyday practice of Dalit life. And he also points out the 9 limiting conditions. First of all, the caste, of course, which are by force and voluntarily arranged in a hierarchical order and presented in Dalit's ways of speaking and behaving. So there are certain language or speaking terms to address the higher class, higher caste of others. And then he also talked about the microaggressions affecting the Dalit self-respect. So, and then comes to the land reform. Yelu Sadhan, he points out the people still believe to give land to Dalit, Dalit as a landlord will bring destruction on the village. And some even believe they are only agricultural workers, so they are not supposed to have land. They are not supposed to be landlord. So, and to the leftists, for the class image sake, they deny the caste condition. They deny caste condition in politics, like Dalit can never be the president or to claim to be the presidency. And then the writer, he accused neo-Brahminism as neo-Nazism. He says it applies ancient tradition like the Ramayana and Mahabharata as the ancient tradition in modern way, which is also a way to hold sways in domestic and foreign policy to increase intolerance towards a non-Hindu culture, as well as the languages. And then he claims Gandhian hegemony makes Dalit impossible to assimilate in both religious and non-religious way. And then he criticized Nehru regime as Nehru dynasty. He claimed that the Nehru centralism denied equality, undermined the democratic right of the constitutive nationalities. And then he also mentioned about the exploitation of natural resource and environment of the other indigenous people, especially in Clara. He emphasized on the Dalit consciousness. He believed Dalitness has to be studied because Dalitness does not indicate any deficiency, born of origin or absence of anything. Is the effect of Savannah domination, devaluing everything that is Dalit. So he urged for a new discipline. Significance to it. So he said it's significance to bring out the view of different belief system and deviation from the mainstream perspective of Indian sociological studies. And then hence it is very important to study the effective history, to know ordinary Dalits. To me, it's really similar to the subaltern studies, which, yeah. can subaltern speak. And then from researching their biography or produce an interview to produce a written discourse to make Dalit has a place in the history. The material of Dalit studies could be a series movement, culture study like pamphlets, journal, creative writers writing, and the other Dalit issues, the backwardness. And then eventually he believed there's a theory has to be produced in this Dalit study.
So are there any questions that you would like to address to the meeting?
Oh, about the myth he talks about.
About the myth?
The myth he said about the noble savage. I couldn't find that one in the...
The noble savage,
yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The noble savage myth. I think Julian knows something about it.
It's like in Europe, they discover tribe in America mostly. They build a criticism of like especially Christian and Spanish and Portuguese were dealing with this savage, because actually this savage were more noble than the conqueror. So some skeptical thinker in Europe thought to build a picture, an imaginary of savage, which actually is more close to nature, so which is better, or at least morally, than the one who's built. So then you have an imaginary of this, somebody close to nature, but still a savage.
And there's another question about, because like the cultural studies, we want to get rid of the grand theory. Yeah, and then but he's looking for the theory, like a system of study that does it sound lot, yeah.
But what does he say about objectivism? Do you remember? The first the requirements of Dalit assumptions of Dalit studies, approaches.
This is one true.
Where is it?
Objective?
Yeah, objectives.
613. It's in front.
Oh, yeah, 612. No, not that. Yeah, I mean, it's not, so I guess the question is, does he see a new discipline, 621. Para 2, can you read them? 621, paragraph 2.
We need to identify new vistas of knowledge and to define the broad area for such branches of knowledge and thus pave the way for a new discipline.
No, 621.
To begin with,
yeah.
To begin with, Dalit studies challenge the objectivity of knowledge and endorses the view that different belief systems and contradictory interpretations are possible.
How would you see the later comment in light of this? No, it's all right. I mean, what does it imply? So can you make an inference from these two things?
He said, because in the previous writing, he said it's not like purely merely challenge the mainstream idea. It also like reflect thinking. But I just think is it workable? practically.
So what kind of theory, if he says Dalit studies challenges objectivity of knowledge and endorses the view that different belief systems and contrary interpretations are possible. So in light of that, if he is wanting to do theory, what kind of theory is he looking at?
Alternative.
Alternative, that's a description of it. Anybody can answer. I mean, we can all discuss this. What kind of theory you think Yesudasan is aiming for when he says Dalits need a theory and a methodology with which to work to explore all these issues in the under the rubric of Dalit studies? Because I think his point is it grand theory, something that explains everything, right? The big claims on the world. Is that what he is aiming for? Is that it?
Maybe not, but how to avoid it?
How to avoid grand theorizing? Yeah.
Because he's looking for the Dalitness. It's like when you want something like Scottiness, or there have to be criteria, then it will be easily create the stereotype, or it will be easily create something. I don't know. Something will be created, and then it's not.
So you're thinking more of the that it gets established as truth, as a final word or something,
the feature. If he like aims at creating something like fixture.
Picture, producing a picture of the world, which is it? No.
Characteristic of the Dalit.
Characteristics of Dalits.
Then it's.
Okay, is it like, are you thinking of an essentialism that they are?
Somehow it gives me the feeling that.
I mean, it's possible. That's what I mean. Of course. So, is it in the direction of essentialism that you are pointing, saying this is a danger of essentializing Dalit identity?
Yes.
Did anybody else get that impression? I mean, in general, in these readings, maybe we can even take it beyond this particular text. But is there in such a thing? Because normally the question posed again for identity is always this: will identities be essentialized? Isn't it? So in that sense, these readings taken together, do they sort of carry that kind of an implication? Is there such a push, such a sort of deviation, such a movement towards? That's an important question, isn't it? That with any Dalit identity movements, as much as any other, remains open to that kind of a questioning. So we have got that question on the agenda, that is essentialist. Is Dalit identity in danger of being essentialized, let's say, by the theoretical efforts that Yesudasan is proposing? So, essentialism as which gives us the theme of essentialism and identity. How to? So you are saying, is it? Can it be avoided? Or how can it be avoided? So, anybody wants to say something about this right now or later is welcome to this. Has anybody thought about essentialism as a problem in identity-related questions? Anything to say? Yeah? Yeah.
From his piece from pages 621 to 623, I think he does say, especially at 623, he says at the first full paragraph, he says that he talks about compiling a Dalit mythology or history of biology.
Yes.
He says that one needs to look to multiple different sources to published manuscripts, diaries, handwritten magazines. So I believe that this can kind of help us understand that it's not about a kind of essentialism or general theory, but rather a kind of diversity. And from my reading of his kind of writings, I think what's interesting is actually on page 22, where he talks about if you're talking about trying to understand what kind of theory of objectivity that the Dalit studies can offer, I think one of the things he kind of mentions in passing is about the idea of Brahminic colonialism. That is kind of like a special part of the Dalit experience that you cannot probably escape the Brahminic colonialism, and so that provides a kind of interesting part in the theorizing of the Dalit experience. And yeah, so he discusses that also on page 61. So the third full paragraph, where he says that.
Sorry, which page are you on?
621. So let's see, is this the first two? I think it's the second full paragraph where he says secondly, right? Secondly, Dalit studies deviates from the mainstream perspective of Indian sociological studies. In the mainstream academic view, India is today in the post-colonial stage where post city means after, and according to the Dalit view, we are living in the new Brahminic era, which is only a continuation of centuries-old Brahminic colonialism. So I think that these few paragraphs kind of puts together two important things. So one is the kind of Brahminic colonialism that is very keen to the Dalit experience, right? And second thing is I think that what he wants to kind of also suggest is that when we're talking about a new kind of discipline or maybe also theorizing, then there needs to be a sourcing towards other different traditions and materials. So that's
to finish that paragraph. So the closing sentence of the paragraph, we have the mid-lap. It is the same white colonialism that opened up the possibility of emancipation of Dalits from under the feet of Brahminic colonialism. Right? So this is also quite interesting.
Yeah, it's attempting a balanced assessment of British colonialism, saying that it actually was an opportunity for Dalits to renew the struggle against caste. So I mean, this is one of the sources of tension within the intellectual sphere in India, in the intellectual sphere and political sphere, which is these positive assessments of the British period, which tend to come from Dalits and other castes. For instance, there is one Dalit intellectual who is a bit, he's a performer. He's more of he tends to do things for provocation. So he started a temple for what he called the English goddess. He's like Bharat Mata, the India, Mother India. He said, for us, Mother English and so on. It's very, in a way, not a very well thought out sort of thing, but it's one of those deliberate provocations which are meant to say something like this, that that you have a different assessment of the past than those who the mainstream India. So that's what this is reflecting also. So the concept, the idea of Brahminical colonialism is something rather new here, isn't it? That it has been treated as many different things, but not quite as colonialism. But the essentialism question remains, because it's with any identity-based movement, you have to deal with that issue. It's inescapable.
Following Professor Chen's the quotation of the white colonialism, it's like the current movement of Dalit, is it like really influenced by the Western movement? Like their activists is like searching for Western help,
Western inspiration.
That's why it gives me a feeling that, because the quotation, the big writer he quotes is from. So I just have.
Well, there's two kinds there also. Theoretically, you have Foucault, but on the other hand, in terms of models in these writings, you have the black, movement against white racism, because the Maharashtrian Dalit movement, actually they call themselves the Dalit Panthers after the Black Panthers. And so there is a lot of inspiration drawn from there. So, but that is yet another question. What you just brought up, which is it necessary to be theoretically self-sufficient to make whatever claims you are making? That does it, if you borrow theory from some Western source, does it somehow contaminate or dilute your political program? This is a serious question, isn't it? It's always there are always people who say, why can't you use Indian theory, that kind of thing. But it's not a very easy question to resolve, because there's no the idea that Indians should employ Indian theory has so many problems built into it, right? The assumptions there are so complicated but it is very it's still a very strong strand in the Indian Academy. There are some people who still write occasionally and lament the fact that Indians go on using Western theories. So it takes many forms. One is, you should not take Western theory. You should only look at your own theoretical resources, which of course are only modern. There are no. But they feel that there is a parallelism. They try to establish a parallelism, just as the West turned to Greece for the Greek philosophy. Indians should go back to Indian philosophy of the ancient period. Now, in Indian philosophy of the ancient period, what can you do with it? Of course, there are many things in ancient Indian philosophy which have parallels in the Western philosophy. But then all you can do is, we also, our philosophers also thought about this. Okay, you can say that. But beyond that, there is no new intellectual value being added by this kind of discussion. That's one issue. The other is that what is the virtue of being indigenous as opposed to being good or bad, that is useful or not, whatever it is that we say about theory. Right? So that's another question. The Dalit writing does not take this question, they don't try to, they don't have the same approach as the nativists, who say that Indians should only use Indian theory, but there is a different sense in which what you are saying is right, what you are saying points to something, which is that vis-a-vis Indian context, there are people who will argue that Dalits should employ Dalit intellectuals' theoretical writings. So, in other words, you can go, West is fine, but within India, Dalit theory, as opposed to that of the non-Dalits writers, that kind of thing. So, in a way, it comes back, in a different form.
But so it's actually very loaded reading. But somehow, at the end of this very sort of epistemological issue, boils down to the question that theoretically, what is the specificity of the Dali? Because the inspiration or the point of inspiration coming from several figures, right? Slavery, right? Or
Slavery,
the lowest class.
right.
This is in the sense of Marxism.
Yeah.
Or another figure is actually so-called indigenous or aboriginal.
Right.
Right? This is the global aboriginal movement. So in that sense, it's very obvious. It's a little bit like Ambedkar heritage. It's actually mobilizing any resources available to come to terms with the specificity of the Dalits.
Right.
It seems to be that overarching drive.
Right.
So in that sense, it seems to be the case. Ambedkar is in a way, the guru of the movement.
Yeah.
But actually, I think the real reason is he has a theory of the Dalits.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Sort of come up with, it's a little bit like he provided the earlier entry,
Yeah.
knowledge-wise, into this zone.
Right.
Right, and so on. So it's for good reason he's always has not been adopted.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the most extensive sort of analysis, theorization, reading of Indian society, ancient and modern, challenging the thought of the best minds in all of that. Yeah, Ambedkar is the shining example.
But I guess under that assumption, we can tap into the wide spectrum of issue with a focus here, right? In the sense that, let's say within the Indian intellectual field, who has provided something analysis,
Right.
versus whatever from the outside,
Right.
and so on. Then who's able to account for the specificity? I think that would be
Right.
much more fair question. Or on that ground. Right? So, but it also seems that this is in a way relatively new field emerging. So I guess for historical and political reasons, people are forced. Almost this is the issue. You cannot slack. Right? If you want to even give account, have a theory of India,
Right.
you cannot escape this issue.
Escape the issue of caste. Yeah.
But this is so complicated because it's also related to the entire notion we've been talking about, the system of caste. But I think there's a new light from at least from the reading, there's some unawareness being registered here.
Unawareness.
Used to be unawareness. I think they opened up new angle. It's a little bit like if you look at the Earth from the point of view of the the most disadvantaged,
Uh-huh.
the certain things unseen will be exposed.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, like for instance, when we look at for me personally, I don't know, the issue of the slavery part, the story being
Right,
told,
that's good, yeah.
it's actually very, very, very dark, and so on. I don't know how other people read in terms of the history of that towards that direction. So it's very, obviously it's very, very difficult to chart theoretically. On a certain point you see very close link between class issue, theoretically. But class-based issue is not identity-based, right? It gives a term. It is the entire capitalist system generated. But of course, you can say the entire class system generates. So I don't know how. This must be the debate, right? We need to actually debate how do we.
Yeah, I mean there is a
Also
debate.
methodological.
There is a debate, but yeah, there is also the kind of within a sort of political activist domain, there is a refusal of that debate itself. Saying caste separately, class separate. It's nothing to do with class. There's that kind of a sort of assertion of separation of caste question from class also. There is, but on the other hand, the left movement keeps trying to integrate these two together. To see caste and class together as intertwined and working together, rather than being two completely separate logics or something.
But I think the real difficulty shooting throughout the very, very difficult question is the assumption for Dalis. It's a little bit like class, but also different in the sense the assumption is it is not an identity, it is something to be abolished.
Yeah.
To begin with.
Yeah.
To begin with. Okay? So this is the assumption of I think the very first piece of writing we could see. So it's not something to hold on to, even if it is an identity is perfectly transitional. So in that sense, it's different from the notion of black.
No, but it's that and this. That's the problem. That there are both tendencies, and they kind of. It's difficult to separate them.
Right.
That's what is the interesting part. And there are, the intellectual efforts are in the direction of understanding precisely that paradox. That what is abolition versus. So let's go to so thank you.
I will be responsible for the two essays. The first one is what is Dalit literature, and the second is Dalit literature is but human literature. And I'll begin with what is Dalit literature, written by Saratandra Mutibo. Dalit literature was born only when Dalit's life is presented through Dalit's point of view, which is constituted the examination of Dalit's living sociality and their sensibility to seek the social reformation. It is a sort of expression of Dalit's thirst to rebel against the suppressions and humiliations within the framework of the Varna system. The Dalit literature embodied the transformation or transition from Dalit's point of view to Dalit insight, which indicates that the writer has a vision of his or her own point of view. The difference among these two is that real life is not synonymous to the viewpoint, but is much more complex and controversial. A writer of Dalit literature should situate him or herself within the distinctive forms of life of Dalit individuals and have profound conscience to experience the pleasure and pains. Therefore, it would be not the simplification of life that deviated from the social reality, but Dalit literature is neither involved itself with the commitment of certain viewpoints to depict life for the sake of its limited purpose. In other words, Dalit literature is expecting to read as commitment to individual lives and therefore involving the point of view of particular historical moments. This Dalit point of view should be visualized as concrete experiences, since Indian life is still existed in real sense, rather than mere an abstract concept. As it was through this vision of real life, thus dedicates the deep consciousness of Dalit thirst for freedom in real sense. And I will go through to the second essay. Dalit's literature is but human literature. It is the establishment of the exploitative state of India that the suffering of the common people, through possessing the doctrine of Varna and caste value, the autocratic states justified its exploitative power to enslave lower caste people. It was by deploying the system of Varna and caste that the division and its inequality created by God was considered as the sacred boundary. On the basis of this sacred boundary or categorization, the autocratic class is people who were endowed with wealth, comfort, power, proximity to God, and claiming to represent the divine. On the other hand, those who were damnable by God were doomed in the life with sorrow, servitude, and untouchability. The ruling class avoided the anti-spiritualism and atheism, since it would dissolve the religious boundary between the superior and inferior. And this was a reason that the exploitative state forbid the Buddhist principles to form the base of social order and consciousness, since the Buddhists instinctively opposed the inequality. Besides that, the ruling class embraces this religious value for it naturalized the concept of untouchability, and thus justified its exploitative character. In other words, the system of Varna and caste were the means for ruling class to ensure itself as superior and protect its class interest, and therefore consolidate the fundamental basis of its governing. The praise of the heroism and celebration of war constitute the value structure of Hinduism, which were considered as sacredness and divinity, but in fact were the fights for power. These glorifications of heroism and wars embodies the violent trait of Hinduism, and thus deeply entrenched into the social cultural fabric and the formation of the social norm, which shaped the consciousness and themes of the literature as the result. Since the heroes and the gods were those who contributed to the establishment of the ruling state, the Sundras and Ati-Sundras, the lowest caste, and were evicted outside the caste framework, and therefore could not situate themselves in the religious and secular literature of Hinduism, such as sacred literature as well as the literature of the saints. These two castes were treated as downtrodden and the weak as enemies. Both sacred literature and the literature of the saints evolved the functions within the ideology underlying the Varna system, although they should be located in different historical and social contexts to examine their political and social purposes. To parallel these two forms of literatures, we should see the continuity of the coexistence of the religious value of Hinduism and the ruling power of the exploitative state, and as well as the absence of lives of common people. Furthermore, the literature functioned as an intellectual and social framework which consolidates and sustains the Hindu feudal state, which oppressed the dynamics to transform the social system of production. It was during the advent of the British and the and the importation of the new knowledge and science and so on, that evoked the new awakening of Western Enlightenment in India. India therefore confronted not just the transformation of social system, intellectual system, and also the new literary expressions, that writers were nurtured with the self-critical thinking. It was the first time when social themes had been written in a literal text, rather than those metaphysical or religious ones. The writers as well as the elite Varnas were forced to examine the Hinduism critically and demanding for the reform. The English novel established a referential framework that lives of poverty and weak could be found in the literal text, which opened up the space for writers to include woman, Shudra, and Ati-Shudra as the theme of the novel. But the writer world failed to have conscience to depict the life of Shudra, Ati-Shudra, since they were in the harmony with Hindu heroism and godhood. And the violent character of Hinduism and the promotion of Varna system leave no space for these two lowest castes to be properly exist in Hindu society and literature. Compared to the violent character of Hinduism, Buddhism provides the resources to reform the Hindu society, to internalize democracy, progressive attitude, and rationalism. Through this consciously internalized democracy, that no one was treated as untouchable, but could be an object of thought. But the Indian elite Varna and intelligentsia could not reach the concept of democracy and activate the social reform because they had been protecting their Hinduism and the Varna system. This made nothing progressive could be committed in the social and cultural domain. This, for Ambedkar, reveals that the class root of Indian intelligentsia, which in fact belongs to the capitalist class. Those Indian intelligentsia who taken the national leadership become the factor that divided the national liberation movement into political movement and social movements during the time of the British regime and the national enlightenment. The division leads to the struggle for national freedom, disarticulating with the deeper social transformation, which encompassed the struggle of social, political, economic, and cultural reform. As a result, the struggle of common people for freedom was not yet achieved. Ambedkar was the one who organized the social movements during this period and awakened many downtrodden people to join the struggle. But they could not find the enemy, since the enemy has been embedded in the Indianness, which inserted in literature, social structure, the traditions, and mind. The caste system and its value constitute the social relations and people's consciousness. What should be noticed is that both Varna and caste obstructed the class consciousness, and it was also weakened through Hindu philosophical concept and faith, such as fatalism. On the other hand, the philosophies of Ambedkar and Fuller were derived from the rebel with a scientific and rationalist attitude. They had critical viewpoint of caste system and intensively opposed social inequality. And this evolved into their perspective of democratic socialism, which were declared enemies and attacked from all sides of the intelligentsia. For those Indian intelligentsia, they value the past because their privileged status was given through Hinduism principles. The common people were as slaves according to this Hindu value Varna system, whom they could only acquire their own identity through the awakening of the caste in the modern times. Dalit literature, in a way, opened up the room for discussion of complexities of unsolved social problems after the nation adopted democracy and the constitution, which still rejected the untouchable in reality. Since the basis of Dalit literature is the living reality and the individual consciousness of the untouchables, the problem of Dalit masses are then the problem of Dalit literature. Dalit is not naturally inherent among human beings, but was dehumanized according to this ritual social system. Dalithood is what constitutes Dalit literature, which voluntarily carries the burdens of the oppressed and the downtrodden. This embodiment of Dalithood signifies Ambedkar as the essence of the social revolution itself, and also makes Dalit literature revolutionary.
Thank you. So that is the literature part. I think since I think the issues in the next set of readings are also literature related, aesthetic questions. So we can have the presentation and then discuss this. Neela will present on Jadhav and Wagmare's number 8 and 9 readings in this.
Number again?
8 and 9.
8 and 9.
Jadhav, huh?
Jadhav
Jadhav.
and Janardhan
Wagmare.
First of all, before I start my presentation, I think it's kind of difficult for me personally to talk about or to understand Dalit literature without having read them before.
Right.
Yeah, so it's kind of like you're trying to understand something that you have never encountered before. So I'm not very sure whether my interpretation of this text is, the correct one. So
No. I mean, these are issues. Which have.
Okay. So I'm going to start with the article, and I'm sorry I don't provide any handouts or PowerPoint presentations, so could you please follow me Okay, so Dalit Feelings and Aesthetic Detachments, written by R.G. Jadhav, and to my understanding he is a literary critic. So in this particular article I can see his point of view of being a literary critic in seeing Dalit literature. He talks about what makes Dalit literature and actually, if I'm not mistaken, how to go beyond Dalit literature itself. First of all, he started with this conference on Dalit literature in 1976 at Nagpur, which sort of proposed that Dalit literature needs to be analyzed not only based on the content, which is filled with social awareness and social issues, but also it's the aesthetic values of Dalit literature itself. Of course, it is not to be argued that Dalit literature is basically a literature of social awareness, but literary criticism could not just be based on the content of its social awareness, but also there should also be a proper analysis on the aesthetic form of Dalit literature that needs to be done. To my understanding, Dalit literature is a literature based on human experience, which is the Dalit experience, and thus there's a strong sense of realism because it is based on the experience of the Dalits. There's a strong sense of realism in Dalit literature. However, the whole Marathi literature is also based on realism, and Dalit literature simply falls into the established norms that have already been there in Marathi literature. I feel that Jadhav sort of proposed that Dalit literature should go beyond the norms and sort of like create varying forms to make its own identity. To do so, he's not emphasizing on the social content of Dalit literature, but the aesthetic form of Dalit literature. He proposed one thing called aesthetic detachment. He realized that Dalit writers lack aesthetic detachment, which is commonly found on forms like drama or comedy. He highlighted some ideas as to why Dalit writers sort of fail to achieve this aesthetic detachment, as can be read in page 306 on the second paragraph. Forms of literature which require greater detachment, such as drama and humor, are yet to be taken up by Dalit writers. It is with reference to such forms that aesthetic detachment can be properly considered. It may be that a detached Dalit sensibility is yet to form itself, and that is why these forms have not appeared in Dalit literature. This fact can be interpreted in another way. Perhaps the Dalit writers, for certain reasons, fail to acquire the aesthetic detachment necessary to portray social feelings and relationships objectively. It is also possible that the form of drama can appear only in an atmosphere of social freedom, and this kind of freedom is also congenial to humor. Perhaps these forms of literature are not as spontaneous as the narrative forms are. An advanced literary culture appears to be necessary for their successful expression. The Dalit writers have not secured the benefit of these favorable circumstances. I suppose here he is some sort of like advocating that Dalit writers need to be able to keep a distance from their work and to be able to assess and self-criticize their situation and their surroundings objectively. My guess is that this is a depart from the previous Dalit writings, which probably are focused on the the suffering and the anguish of being a Dalit, so the Dalit experience. I read the introduction of this book, Poison Bread. It's written by, I forgot the name. Somewhere here. Arjun Dangle.
Yeah.
Okay, Arjun Dangle. He mentioned that the Dalit literature is filled with revolt and negativism. So I suppose that Jadhav was trying to, advocate that you need to depart from this, writing that is filled with anguish and sorrow and negativism, and try to sort of like see the situation, the circumstances objectively, so that critical awareness can be built, and then it will sort of make the literary text produce richer and have deeper insight, if I'm not mistaken. And here I can see that Jadhav used the example of Meshram, and he mentioned how Meshram, this personality is very introspective and self-critical, able to realize its worth and meaning for oneself, and this is I think it's very different from the Dalit consciousness that was sort of like that has been there before, and he mentioned that to achieve this kind of critical manner, one has to be able to have an objective attitude towards the surrounding. Another example that he also mentioned is the stories from Baburao Bagul, a very famous poet. If
Yes,
I'm
the
not
one
mistaken.
whom we just said.
And Jadhav thinks that Bagul has a deep poetic insight, but the problem is that he is far too involved with the dramatic content of his stories, and it's interesting how he mentioned that if had Bagul controlled the poet in him, he would probably produce a wider creative form. And he went on again to talk about how artistic detachment is not found in poetry, which is getting standardized there. But he also said here in page 310, the last sentence of the second paragraph, so if poetry turns from the abstract to the concrete forms of experience, it can develop through narrative description and the creation of atmosphere. The new emotional equivalences needed for this can develop perhaps through objective story poems. I'm not necessarily sure what kind of form it is, the story poems, but I'm interested in his words of, he used objective quite a lot. So I'm sort of thinking that Jadav is saying that it is important to write about social issues, to raise social awareness, but it is equally important to do that with detachment, to do that with a critical feeling, so to not be too entrenched in this sorrow and anguish and detach themselves from that, and thus sort of like make a higher literary forms. What kind of forms would that be? I'm so sure. Yeah, so that's basically, I think, the first article from R.G. Jadav. And the next one is about Black literature and Dalit literature. As can be seen, this is a comparative study of Black literature and Dalit literature. Janya dan Wakmari sort of like look at the Black literature and the Black experience to examine Dalit experience and also Dalit literature. Of course, the Black experience and the Dalit experience is in a way different because Dalits did not experience slavery of being taken away from their home country and being placed in a different country and then being sold. However, the Dalits are alienated by the people of their own country, by the people of their own race. And I think it is to the point that Dr. Ambedkar even say Gandhiji have no homeland because they're actually in their own country but not feeling any sense of belonging in that particular place with the people of their own race. And in page 314, it is written that there is no difference whatsoever between the position of the blacks, in the paragraph, the American black, there is no difference whatsoever between the position of the blacks in America and that of the untouchables in India, and hence a long period of time, both were caught in the whirlpool of self-denigration and self-hatred. Both were kept behind the bars of fatalism. Okay, so even under this very disgracing circumstances, the blacks struggled and they sought for education. And it's interesting because it's mentioned here that they gave up fatalism. To my understanding, looking at from the Dalit experience, there's a sense of that fatalism there in a way that it's as if that them being Dalits are some sort of a fate, or it's like karmic. So if you're Dalit, that's because of what you've done in the past, and then you just have to accept because it's fate. I'm not sure whether this, the sense of fatalism here was attempted to be dismantled before Dr. Ambedkar sort of like came and gave new perspective on how Dalits should see themselves. Yeah, okay, so that part. So there's they have the same struggle because they are, both the blacks and the Dalits are longing for this like social reformation and also like some freedom from discrimination and alienation. The thing is, the difference probably lies on the literary history. Like the blacks have rich literary history, and even when they are not writing about their own experience, the white authors can actually write about their own experience. And if I'm not mistaken here, the same case does not happen in Dalit literature, as in the higher castes do not actually write using their voice to voice out the Dalit experience. In 317, page 317, second paragraph, it is mentioned that in India, a Eugene O'Neill or a William Faulkner is yet to be born to depict Dalit life. So there's no people of higher castes who actually write for them. And I think that is probably, it's one of the reasons why Dalit literature is not as rich in terms of quantity, as black literatures, and also probably have something to do with them being denied of education and thus low literacy from the Dalit experience. Probably you can shed light on that. And Janardhan continues to elaborate the progress of the Black literature with the emerging of the new Black, and also like the coming of Richard Wright with his very important novel, The Native Son. And ever since that, the Black literature become revolutionary in a sense. And he mentioned how it take the Black writers some decades to achieve this revolutionary stance, but at this revolutionary horizon, this is where the Dalit literature actually began. Dalit literature gained a new stance with the stories of Baburo Bagul, the When I Had Concealed My Caste, and then it sort of like gave the Dalit literature a new stand. And this is because the struggle of Dr. Ambedkar, I think it has been mentioned a lot of time how Dr. Ambedkar plays a very vital role in Dalit movements, and that is probably also why he is seen as the pioneer in Dalit movement. Janardhan continues on to talk about the similarities of the Black literature and Dalit literatures. He even put it here in page 231. What are the similarities of the Dalit literatures and Black literatures? I assume that the need to sort of like compare the Black literatures and Dalit literatures is there because of the Black influence in 1970s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
1970s, they were very much influenced by the Black literatures, and the organization that you mentioned before, Dalit
Panthers,
which was established in 1972, and if I'm not mistaken, it was the first writer organization in India.
The first
The first time that writers sort of like got together and make a political stance and political movement.
Yeah, no. I mean, that was the beginning of a new stage in the politicization of Dalits, and yeah, writers were, there were no writers wing to the Dalit movement before that point. Yeah, you're right.
So I think, probably that's all from me. Thank you so much.
One thing I would like you to, if you have or anybody, this idea of what he's saying, the Jadhav is saying when he talks about standardization. I think there's something important there, which if you will, he's saying, what does it mean to say Dalit poetry is getting standardized? There is also a slight, the reason I want to clarify that the language of the translation, it's a translation, so one has to see what it means, because it may be that what is implied there is not standardization per se, meaning by standardization we mean something which is different. But what from the description of it, what exactly is he describing? What is the problem? Because this he is advocating aesthetic distance for a number of reasons, right? And so he says this standardization, to avoid standardization you should write story poems and so on. What is that standardization?
I'm not entirely sure about what kind of forms this poetry, Dalit poetry is actually like.
No, but standardization, that is you are right in saying you don't have the actual things to talk about. But is this does it carry an echo of something that one is familiar with?
My previous assumption was that it's probably because they keep talking, or not necessarily keep talking, but they write in the point of view of this Dalit suffering and anguish and sorrow. Because here it's mentioned that Dalit poets face squarely the stories of social injustice and outrage that appear in newspaper and give them passionate poetic expression. So the poetic expression of this anger and social injustice. is it probably the standardization that all Dalit writers would all talk about this social
yeah.
issues and social awareness?
Yeah.
Like, because in the previous one, Meshram was really has a very
Yeah,
different
different.
personality.
Yeah.
So my previous assumption was something like that.
Yeah, no. Meshram and Bagul, yes, that contrast is a very interesting one between the restraint and stylistic sort of formal qualities of Meshram versus the sheer sort of passion which just overflows in terms of Bagul's writing. You can see even this essay which Vicky presented, the Bagul's essay on the Dalit writing. Even there, you can see, he's a man of great unrestrainable energy. He just, anger, everything comes out like that, in a torrent, as it were. Yeah. But this standardization, it's like what is, see, in if you say lyric romantic poetry, right? So what is, say for instance, the sonnet form? So basically, you can do, anybody can write the sonnet form by assuming, a distant lover, some Lara or some other woman, and then you write a sonnet to that. So that means it's a set form. So you put yourself into that form and then produce a lyric, right? It's something on those lines that here is a trend in Dalit literature where everybody is sort of writing about oppression in a particular similar sort of standardized form, if you like. There is a set of ingredients that it has. So you just put your experience into that mold, and then it becomes a Dalit poem. So this kind of a thing. It's a very sort of focused kind of critique, which is useful to. I mean, it's not just Dalit writing that in fact, what he is saying is, this is not true only of Dalit writing, but Marathi poetry in general. These conditioned reflexes that he says, just cliched, kind of repetitive things. So the story poem question comes where he says, if Dalit poets want to break out of this kind of a thing, which is not just their problem, but the general problem of poetry in the period, maybe because since they have these unique experiences, so instead of just saying, I suffered, and using all these cliched forms, he's saying, go and describe the uniqueness of the singularity of your story, the story that is yours, based on your experience. So converting it into so he's basically saying, shift into a different form, in which the uniqueness of your experience can actually have a play. Because in this form, in this standardized form, what is happening is all experiences are getting processed through the same set of cliched motifs. So there's nothing left, no distinction is possible. So he's saying it's an interesting kind of critical move that he's making. A critic who is also a kind of master, right? He's not just saying critically, like an academic criticism, but also like an elderly advice or something like that. But it's an interesting piece of thing. And similarly, in that essay, the difference between point of view and insight, right? That is, in fact, very interestingly similar kind of proposition. That is, you have a point of view. You have an argument, you have the Dalits are suffering and Dalits, the mainstream, the Brahmins are, the caste system is oppressing and so on, all of these kinds of, this argument. Now what happens is in the writing, this argument prevails and, people again, they just feed the experience into this argument. So it gets reduced to those already given forms, and the distinctiveness and the singularity of it is again lost. So that's why he says point of view is not enough for a literature. Point of view is there for everybody. Every Dalit has that point of view. Every Dalit knows the story of oppression in its general sense. But for it to become literature, it has to move beyond that and capture the distinctiveness of something. That's where the insight comes, right? So very similar kind of arguments, but very different sort of. That is talking more in terms of the novel, and this is talking in terms of poetry, right? And saying something similar about how things then get typified, rigidified, and disallow, not allow for genuine, insightful literary expression, right? How this in this battle between the singularity of individual experience and its expressibility and the necessary forms. See, obviously a form is necessary, in the sense there are forms already in existence. You can't say I will write something unique which has a form which is unique to it, because form is always to some extent objectively given. There is a novel, there is a short story, there is a lyric poem, there is a play. These are all forms. You work through them. But the danger is that certain established modes will impose their logic onto your experience, and so the kind of. So Dalit, so in some ways there are some of these problems are general problems, not Dalit literature's problems alone. But obviously there is the other question that has figured in of these things is, so what is Dalit literature? So so you say Baburao Bagul says it's Dalit literature is but human literature. It's just human. So everybody is in some ways saying that, right? Even Jadhav says it's about these are shared problems. Everybody's. So in these sets of writings, actually the problem of identifying Dalit literature comes to the fore. Yeah? So how do you identify it? Is it by theme? Is it by who wrote it? Yeah? Why should you call it Dalit literature? Why can't you just say it's literature and put it there? Right? Because should you write only for Dalits, or are you writing for the non-Dalits also? Do you want your literature to enable a dialogue with the upper castes, or is it meant only to inspire the Dalits towards action, and so on? We have a series of questions, right, that have been raised in this. Yeah, well, great, wonderful. Yeah, no, the stories. You made a very I mean, it occurs to me I could have provided one or two, especially Baburao Bagul's poetry is very powerful poetry because of this precisely. But he is a short story writer basically. And there is another poet, Dasal. He is also extremely sort of emotional and very critical, very harsh and penetrating kind of satire and so on. So yeah, so I'll try to send everybody some of these things so you can read it. But yeah, I figured in some ways identity questions, these kinds of, why should you define a literature by by some ethnic or other kind of identity, why should you say that? Is it necessary? Does it serve a purpose? These questions are there. And then the question in relation to such movements, literary movements, about the these issues, balance between aesthetic and content, because this content oriented writing, what makes Dalit literature is the experience of Dalits, which is unique. But then, is it enough to just, let the, just throw the experience out there without any formal and other kinds of considerations? Or is there an aesthetic issue to be also dealt with, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, what about questions? What kind of further questions can we put to the class?
So, like you mentioned before about what is actually Dalit literature, has that question been answered? Like, because from my reading, it's like it's very much defined by the human experience, that makes it necessarily Dalit. But what about like the progress up to now? You mentioned earlier that it has been flourishing.
Yeah.
Do they still take up the same content, raising social awareness?
No, in a way, it remains a key element, right? But also, say for instance, is it about the community? Right? This is another question. Like Dalit literature is essentially, you don't write as yourself, you write as a member of a community. This is one stage. But nowadays there are also writers who write in a very individualized way about the experience, because what has happened meanwhile is India has seen tremendous urbanization process, changing the sheer number of people, the percentage of people who now live in urban as opposed to rural areas is just dramatic. And so the Dalit, as much as anybody else, has the urban experience in which isolation, so it becomes, Dalit experience becomes not just a communal experience, but of, say, in a very anonymous kind of urban context, suddenly somebody sees you and recognizes you as Dalit, right? By your name, by your color, by your something, right? And then there is that experience. Now this is a very individualized experience, right? You go to rent a house and they will ask you something, a series of questions which then they figure out, and then they'll tell you, so in many different ways, straight dismissal, get out of here, we don't, you untouchable, or more indirect ways, we don't give, having, and so on, these kinds of things, which are also again, I don't know, it's the Wole Soyinka had that poem, right, in this, when we're on the phone, he's talking to this lady who has a room to rent, and then she says, yes, come along and have a room, and then he feels conscience stricken and he says, but I have to tell you, madam, I am black, and so on, that kind of a thing, which of course for the black, it is only on the phone that he would need. But the Dalit is not so visible a difference. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So therefore, so these kinds of new changes, new kind of experiences have given rise to a new kind of trend also in Dalit literature. So, the issues also keep changing. For instance, what Baburao Bagul says here, or what the earlier sort of, see the Marathi ones that are the last, as I said, the last set, the second set, which are all from Poisoned Bread, that is from 5 to 10, these are all from the 70s and 80s, 70s mostly. So they are the early things. And they are extremely, and you can see that even at that time, they were already thinking about the decline in the quality of Dalit literature in terms of, the standardization and other things, and how you must, learn detachment and so on. These issues have always been there. Even now, there are people who will argue. I mean, now there are more and more issues about, what qualities make it literary and so on. But on the other hand, one thing is this going back to this idea of abolition and identity. Today it's more likely, you are more likely to say, in the past people would try to give more general definitions. Dalit literature is that which is about the oppressed. They need not be untouchables, they may be tribals, they may be somebody else and so on. But today it has become a little more ethnically identified. Dalits are only the untouchables. So that's one kind of trend which is more increasing today, right? It's also because certain governmental categories have their own way of influencing thinking in the literary, political domain. Governmental categories separate the untouchables from the tribals and from the minorities, etc. So sometimes they form coalitions. Like in my university, for instance, the students, there is a coalition of Dalit, tribal and minority students. They have a union of their own. So this kind of a coalition can happen in other, even in the political field. But the ethnic identification is becoming much stronger now. And even within the Dalit category, the further divisions are becoming more and more prominent. So, for instance, within that there is a Chamar, there is a Mahar, Mala, Madiga, Paraya, Pulaya, etc. So, they tend to nowadays assert their identities as such, not under the Dalit as a political category. Dalit is a political category which sort of unites all of the untouchable castes. But today there is a trend towards separate identities, assertion of separate identities. So in that sense, it's more about identity as involving a certain amount of a certain concept of, if you like, cultural capital, that we are, it's only as a community that we can ensure, maintain, some place for us in this world, right? Because otherwise you're denied everything. So unless you say, here I am, unless you can, somebody that your name is called out along with other names, all other names are there in the public discourse. Your own name gets submerged, concealed. So now there is a sense that whatever it is, you want your name also to be called out in the public domain, right? Let it be there as, these are the people, the Madiga population, who have this particular history and who are now in the public domain along with all the others. That kind of a logic is catching on a lot more nowadays.
Final essay.
Wankhede, yeah.
It's very clear he's arguing sort of, I don't know whether this is the earlier phase.
This is the earlier phase, yeah.
Right? Very obvious the Dalit writer must write for the Dalit masses.
Yeah.
Only for them.
Only for them, yeah.
So this, you read into, this is basically community building.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's too much scattered.
Exactly, yeah.
So this is the earlier phase. Then you describe like your university student then become a different phase. So in some way the community building into a different stages.
Yes, different kind of, different logics also. There are some who believe in this, some who believe in something else, So different in different places, different logics operate. But there is a trend, overall trend towards the splitting of the Dalit category into its more caste components. So the different castes are asserting their own identities separately.
But you point to, this is the sort of aesthetic piece, aesthetic detachment. 306. page number 306.
Yeah.
It's actually very much clear, announce the mission. It shall be the mission, sort of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 line. From
Yeah. It shall be the mission.
Mission Dali writing to transcend established norms and standards and to create new ideals and norms emerging out of it. And one, again, this is back to the abolishing issue.
Yeah.
And one can read that into this, right?
Yeah.
Or I forgot somewhere, it probably yet on the aesthetic front, calling for something like magic realism.
Yeah, right. There is a reference to magic.
Create sort of some form specific to the Dali aesthetics and so on.
That comes in the Pradipan, the one that we will talk about after the break, maybe. Yeah.
And so the, again, come back to the comparative, comparison between black literature.
Black and
This is the 321, right? And he laid out
Yeah.
all the major similarities and so on. But then by now, I don't know how to think about it. If the abolishing issue is still on the forefront, it's a different drive and motif. Right?
Yeah.
The black writing by now is pretty much beyond the stage of
Yeah. Right.
preservation.
Yeah.
Right? Sort of content, but you want to be sort of abolishing discrimination, of course. But this is the very much, there is one utopian moment. It's actually about the abolishing the entire system,
Yeah.
right? Of the caste system.
Abolish. Yeah, so this is that abolition itself is an interesting idea. How do you abolish is the question people are asking. What does it mean? Because if you can actually say that it is abolished, because the Indian constitution says there is no caste. Caste is not recognized in India.
You say that on administrative paper, they
Huh?
say that on administration, you say that they put that you from this caste or you...
No, so caste is, first of all, discrimination on the basis of caste is prohibited. But for historical reasons, those who are being victims of caste oppression will be given special provisions, which to enable them to join the mainstream. That's the idea, right? So in other words, the caste is not recognized as a social category. By the constitution abolishes caste.
But the police, the administration,
Yeah.
they still deal with caste.
No. So once you abolish, the fact is in society it still remains. So police have to, you have to administer that means, no. What I am saying is the abolition is what is at issue here. If it means who can abolish, the state can abolish, right? So the state has abolished. But society, see, Ambedkar once made a comment that if, see, any criminal law, any criminal code, if you say this is a crime, the assumption is that this is an exceptional event. That one person here will steal, another person here will steal. Stealing is an individual act, which is against the community. But if there is something which everybody does, openly does, that you can't have a criminal law to deal with that, because it's the whole community is doing it. So he says, you can't deal with caste by abolition and rule. One rule which says it is wrong to practice caste, because it's not one person here, one person there who is showing racial discrimination or caste discrimination. It's not some individual act. It's communities. These communities are practicing caste discrimination. It's entire villages, entire societies. How will you deal with it with law? That's the thing, right? So that's the contradiction which continues to prevail. So, that is at one level what abolition actually means and how it can possibly be evicted. The other is whether the identity movements are going against the abolition logic or in fact are a different way of achieving abolition in a social sense, in a strict social sense. That is identity opposed to abolition, or is identity also a form of movement towards abolition, not in the constitutional legal sense, but in a proper social sense. It's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean,
No, I guess one of the issues can be play on the form, especially for Dali, because of the assumption. Because contemporary identity politics doesn't have to be on abolition. This is challenging discrimination, of course.
right, yeah.
It's like a women's movement never trying to abolish women's
Right, yeah.
status, right? And so on. You can't say the disappearance of people don't argue that way. The abolishing of the patriarchy, meaning the disappearance of
women.
women or men. But this is predicated on that. So, but of course, maybe people, different people trying to take different positions. Even the Dali right. I don't know.
No, of course, the people take different positions on this, and by and large, this division is between those who feel that you have to make, you have to work under a broad left umbrella, raise the caste question, but within the left sort of discourse. The others who say it is an entirely different issue, it has to be like, in radical feminism, so, socialist feminism, that type, roughly that type of division, I would think. But I don't think it has the same meanings as that division. The meanings tend to be slightly different. But I think we should break and then quickly come back. Thank you all both very much, Vicky and Neela, full of the way in which Dalit writing, critical writing, sort of deals with mainstream sort of texts. This essay talks about how this filmmaker is talking about a sports, an athlete, a boxer actually, who is neglected and who then, the state fails to recognize him. But in the process of glorifying this person who's dead and who's neglected, the film is completely insensitive to the poor people around him, who in their own poverty, in their own desperation, may steal something, may act a little, selfishly and so on. And so these are all portrayed as, inhumanity. The reactions of the poor are represented as inhumanity. So in other words, it sort of narrowly focuses on the injustice done to a person of great achievement. And its idea of justice is confined to those kinds of issues of, does the state recognize and so on, the merit and so on. But what I would like to focus on out of this is this Pradeepan's essay, the third of these essays, that is number 3, Nationalism, Modernity, Carelessness, a Subaltern Critique, which is actually proposes some very interesting ideas for discussion. One of them is, I want to particularly focus on, is this difference that he elaborates between how caste is dealt with. So the common background to this is that under British rule, various developments, in relation to caste communities and how they reform themselves, what they do to improve their own community lives, and also to build community capital and develop some kind of sort of strength in the public sphere, right, so that they are not neglected, they are not ignored, they are not suppressed, and so on. So there are developments, and caste becomes an issue, as we saw in the earlier writings that we have been reading, that everybody is concerned with caste, right, because the Enlightenment thought which comes to India through these colonial and other kinds of channels shows Indians a mirror, puts a mirror before them, in which they see caste as one of the truly shameful things in their society which they must deal with, and everybody is dealing with it, right. So there is in the 19th century Brahmin upper caste societies are completely sort of dominated by this concern about caste, wanting to get rid of these kinds of backward qualities. And so in the Bengali Calcutta context, you see a series of reformers who try various types of things, starting a new religion like Brahmo Samaj, or elsewhere starting an Arya Samaj, Prarthana Samaj, Theosophical Society, and so on, trying to purify Hinduism, get rid of all the superstitions, and make it somehow remove idol worship from it, make it more spiritual rather than based on ritual, etc. Right? This kind of, and also dealing with all kinds of caste practices such as child marriage, widows being disallowed to marry, and various kinds of practices which are related to caste and which constitute the evidence of caste based oppression and so on. So there is a lot of such dealings. What Pradeepan is showing is something interesting, that in the course of this kind of concern with caste, which is spread across all castes, it's not confined to Dalits. What happens is a kind of two different logics begin to operate, and roughly these logics are, one is a national logic and one is more a regional logic, right. So he gives you many examples of these reformers in Kerala, for instance, like Ayankali, a Dalit reformer, and say Narayana Guru, another community, Elava, and Yohanan, who is Dalit Christian, and the other essay number 2, Sanal Mohan, is about slavery. It deals with the movement started by this person, Poikal Yohanan, which actually breaks away from Christian. It's a Christian community, but it breaks away from Christianity and emphasizes the history of slavery, the memory of slavery, as the basis of a community identity. And so Sanal Mohan's essay, the numbers 2 essay here, deals with how that community sort of produces a whole discourse of slavery, around which the community is sort of united, and which involves various enactments and performances related to that memory, recalling various atrocities, various experiences of suffering, and various types of hardships experienced in working conditions, and so on, right. That's the no. So anyway, so there are all these reformers. Now, what he is saying is that this kind of response is happening in the regions, in many regions. Different reformers are coming forward. What they do is they establish a kind of sect, So they see Dharma Paripalana Sangha. Then each one has started something, a group, a name, for a sect. And these sects, basically what they do is they try to unify members of that community and they try to give them a new set of values in the modern world, which are a kind of compromise between their own identity as existing community, but also informed by these modern ideas, right. So, they encourage the idea of workers, the value of work and so on, new kinds of ways in which they try to develop an identity which breaks away from the hierarchy of caste and becomes a community. So there are all these developments, and Pradeepan's question basically is, why are these people not national heroes? How come they don't figure in the history of the struggle against caste? So what he does is he contrasts this regional thing with another kind of anti-caste sensibility, which is also informed by Enlightenment values, modern values, but which takes the form of an individualized sort of attempt to transcend caste and become Indian, in a abstract way, secularism, you become. So this is to be seen in, say for instance, in a Nehru. For a Nehru, caste is a kind of existential thing, that we are from there, and you have to. So you have to get into a new space where caste doesn't operate. So you cleanse yourself of caste and so on. So others, like he cites a lot of writers, even from Kerala. So within Kerala, there are writers who are modernist writers, for instance, who talk about their own, sort of disagreement with caste, their own disidentification with the whole caste society to which they belong, how they move out of it, how they become part of a different thing, how they wander. They have no. So they sort of become homeless. They leave behind all this and become. So in other words, their writing is about caste in its abstract sense, as something, and that is what happens at the level of the nation, India. So it's a kind of contrast, which is a very interesting contrast between socially grounded movements which are trying to sort of pull people out of caste through these kinds of movements and of community forming activities on the one hand, which are not just spiritual, they have social, economic and other dimensions. So they are happening on the ground. You can see something like this in every region of India. Actually, these attempts to reform internally, and for instance, they set up hostels. They set up different kinds of institutions where people can go, if they belong to that caste, and they can access urban sort of opportunities like education, employment, etc. So it's a very grounded, very practically oriented kind of reformist activity, right? As opposed to this kind of existential sort of way in which you are, you make caste into a question of modern versus backward and so on, and it functions as something that a kind of reflexivity, exploration of your existence, yourself as a person. Am I this casted person, or am I secular, and so on. Say for instance, one of the most famous examples of such novels is U.R. Ananthamurthy's Samskara. It's a very emblematic. Even today, it's considered the most important of these novels. So, if you read this novel, it's basically about how a Brahmin faces this existential crisis. So, there is a Brahmin, very, very orthodox Brahmin, and he has a brother who is not so orthodox, who mingles with all kinds of people, and this Brahmin and he dies. So because he has married or he's lived with lower caste woman, the village, the Orthodox Brahmins don't want to touch his body. They say he's polluted, right? So his brother has a existential crisis because he is inherently a good person. So he can't. He has to deal with this dilemma. He's the religious guru, leader of the community, and he faces this crisis. And so in the end, he decides that it should be done. He breaks the taboos and so on. So this is a kind of idea of how an individual goes through this existential struggle to emerge into modernity. So it's happening at the level of the mind, right? It's happening at the level of individuals who are facing the problem of self-definition. So that contrast is what Pradeepan brings out very vividly in this essay, and points out how this aspect has never got its due as the most significant ground level sort of set of initiatives which make for transformations which are not sort of they don't posit some goal, secularism, some enlightenment as a goal to be reached. It's not an ideal, but it's much more of a concretely how to bring this community into a different space, what to do on a daily basis, in terms of institutionalization, organization, community, invocation of community, in terms of everyday practices, which how to pray, whom to pray to, what should you do, and what should you do if you are a member, and if somebody else in this community needs some help, how to institute mechanisms. These are concrete issues that they are dealing with, and they generate these kinds of spiritual leaderships also, which have a continuity with the old Hindu idiom, but they are not orthodox. They are different. They are new, and there is no model on which they are based. They are very new developments which combine all kinds of materials to bring something into existence. So that is one of the most important, I believe, things that this essay sort of and also Pradeepan has this argument that for instance, about this identity question, what is Dalit literature type of question. As far as Pradeepan is concerned, he says when the definition is very loose, that is, all oppressed people are Dalits or something like that, it sort of dilutes and it reduces the role of Dalits themselves, the untouchables themselves, in such things. He cites an anthology in which it's supposed to be a Dalit anthology, but very few of them are actually Dalit writers. So he says, women's writing or black writing, etc. It is about who they are, who is writing, rather than what is written about. And so he argues very convincingly. He argues that it should be only about Dalits, about untouchables. It should be only writing by untouchables and not just anybody, because the purpose of it is to enable a particular community to actually do this work of and find a place in history, in public life, and so on. Right? Narrativizing the history of slave suffering, Sanil Mohan, as I've said, is this very disturbing indeed story of this, the slavery which which was experienced by Kerala, the untouchables in Kerala for many centuries, and which even after its abolition in the mid-19th century continues in some way, right into the 20th century. And this very unique way in which this Yohanan then sort of reconstitutes, recenters a community around the memories of slavery. Right? And the entire discourse, Sanil Mohan gives you a very detailed picture of the discourse of that community. The different kinds of slave memories, slave tears, the age of slavery, the slave body, the yoke of the slave, the chains, and so on, and how they all feature in these performances, these recitations of stories that happen. And how membership of the community is also what is called Raksha Nirnayam, is a very elaborate process in which there is all this storytelling. And Pradeepan, to come to Pradeepan again, he starts with this quote about individualism, how Indian spiritualism is individualist. Basically, it says, how can you get moksha? How can you, get release from the bondage of life? It doesn't have a community character. That is the essence of Hinduism. Caste is not a superstructure because it includes the economic dimension within it as well. Now, this is an interesting proposition also. So, instead of when we think about caste and class, usually the gloss we put on caste and class is caste is social, class is economic. But here he is saying that caste has its own economic dimension. It's not that it's just a social thing. And there's a treatment of literature here. The literature of, say, for instance, Thakali Shivashankar Pillai, who is a very celebrated Malayali writer with a left kind of progressive ideology, in whose writings the representation of Dalits is there, but it is confined to their very, very narrow aspirations. So, he says, for instance, that he shows how even the Marxist leader EMS Nambudripad and a writer like Thakali Shivashankar Pillai, they don't recognize the importance of people like Ayankali, who mobilized and organized the oppressed Dalit castes in order to find a place for them in the public domain. So, caste sensibility has two nodes, he says. At the all India level, there is a public node which is related to nationalism and whose ideological base is spread across India. And the second node is a complex regional cultural life structure where it's a matter of a layering of castes and the embodied rituals and beliefs. So, in the second thing is where you find these kinds of developments. So, Sri Narayana Guru, who introduces a casteless spirituality, which also includes Western ideas such as the idea of a worker, and deals with economic issues, and that what does the community need? Well, it needs factories as well as libraries and so on. So, dealing with a comprehensive set of issues, right? So, in other words, what he says is this is a regionally grounded modernity. That is, it is influenced by modern values, but it's trying to deal with actual problems of where you are, and not treating it as an ideological or spiritual issue. So, Chandu Menon, who wrote what is considered one of the first novels in Kerala, Malayalam, Indulekha, and who is much more of the national kind of sensibility, he contrasts these kinds of developments. The former related to a modernization process based on a materialist production-centric environment and the idea of social justice. And it also absorbed industrial ideals. By contrast, the national modernity transmitted the strange notion that to destroy caste it was enough to be a universal citizen, and that there was no need for the specific contexts or the broader environments of caste to change. So, in other words, it is just that you become universal citizen. So, again, so what he is saying is it's an individual solution. Just like you get moksha or nirvana as an individual attainment, caste free identity is also an individual thing. You become secular and then you cease to be. So it doesn't deal with the social dimensions of caste. The regional modernities based on anti-caste ideology and social economic democracy were set aside and European rationality endorsed. So, in other words, the engagement with the caste question was at the abstract level of ideas and philosophies with no relation to the actual networks of caste society. The immediate reality of caste is submerged by this nationalist universalism. So, he points out that in 1 year, when one particular period, there is Keshav Menon who goes to England. And of course, having gone to England, he becomes a universal citizen and he loses, caste in that other nationalist way, right? That is individual purification. Whereas the same time, Krishnadi Asan is starting a Pulaya Mahajana Sabha for the Pulayas who are an untouchable caste. He starts something and he believed that organizing people was the way to freedom. Kesava Menon doesn't think so. For Kesava Menon, it's like, you have to cleanse yourself individually. And he also, that is this Pulaya leader, he also tried to provide his community with education. The rationality of a modernity that stemmed from his own material environment. So these are all the people, Krishnadi Asan, Ayangali, Poikal, Yohanan, etc., Narayana Guru, they never became Kerala's national leaders, or they were never recognized, saying these are the people who took us out of caste system into modernity, although that's what they were doing. So they were building what he calls community capital. The Congress and the communists, he also points out, also do not treat caste as a central issue. And he also discusses this the most celebrated Malayalam writer of recent times, M.T. Vasudevan Nair, who has, in a way, in his novels, the Tharavad, he has reclaimed this Tharavad. Tharavad is a very Kerala phenomenon. These Tharavads are these matrilineal homesteads. Kerala is a society which was matrilineal up to almost end of the 19th century. That means that the family was centered around the mother's home. People generally identified themselves with the mother's home. The father was not the center of the pet. It is not that it's matriarchal; it's matrilineal. That in this, father is there, but it's a very unusual system which prevails in some other parts also, which is that there is a male person who handles all kinds of public things. So it's matrilineal. It's an uncle rule, That is, the mother's brother is the male head of this household. This was a peculiar system in the sense that the Nayars, the main people who used to practice this is the Nayars. And it was the practice that Nayar women could marry for short periods different people. So they had these marriages which were very easily married and easily divorced. That is, they say that, for instance, so a woman would have married somebody and one day she will put his slippers outside the home. That means he is no longer welcome or something like that. This kind of, it seems very, liberated. But actually speaking, it has a relation to another system, which is the Brahmin. The Brahmins in Kerala are landlords caste. Now, in the Brahmin Nambudiri system, Nambudiri family, only the eldest son had the permission to marry. The other sons were not allowed to marry because it was about inheritance. That you don't want to break up the inheritance. So only the eldest married. The others, so these other men, what do they do for their sexual lives? So for these Nair women were available, right? So they formed alliance. So Nair women were married by both Nair men and Brahmin men in this temporary sort of way, right? So this is kind of peculiar and in retrospect an oppressive system, but so that system breaks down in the 20th century with the modern ideas and so on. The Nair society starts to become patrilocal, patrilineal and patriarchal. But what M.T. Vasudevan Nair, this novelist, what he's does is he starts to write novels in which this Tharawad life, so the homestead, of this kind of household is called the Tharawad. So this Tharawad is a huge kind of home and the lands that belong to it, etc., and this whole hierarchy of people. So Vasudevan Nair's novels kind of evoke a nostalgia for this lost life of the Tharawad, because in the 20th century it's all broken down. So in the late 20th century, Vasudevan Nair is the most popular, biggest, sort of most prolific writer. And so Pradeepan's point is that this modern sensibility is actually now dealing with this kind of he is already nostalgic for these kinds of things, because obviously this was also part of the caste order, right? So to point to the way in which caste remains in the minds of people, and all these this Brahmin tooth powder and the some other caste has some other things which are sold in the market which continue to have caste references and so on, right? So I think basically that's the main thing, that this Pradeepan's point about how, see, for instance, all these writers, M.T. and O.V. Vijayan, Anand, Mukundan, Zachariah, very big writers, very well known across India. They wrote as if they were writing Malayalam from Europe, it says, because they're dealing with things in the abstract, in the existential domain, without reference to the social ground. Casteless city aesthetics. Mukundan's character asks, who am I? This whole existential issue, that's what he is trying to highlight there. Right. Then he talks about the autobiography as a form that has developed in Kerala in more recent times, although we have gone through Yesudasan, Muktibodh, Bagul, Kasbe. This Rao Sahib Kasbe wants to avoid defining Dalit literature. He says it's not a good idea to define it because then it restricts you. And the last one, the Wankade, one of the points he makes, which is also something we should discuss, is this whole difference between individual, right, the community question and this whole freedom of expression. He challenges the notion of freedom of expression, saying that it is somehow related to what Pradeepan is talking about also, because what he is saying is this freedom of expression is again posed in a very individualistic way. My freedom to say what I want, not in terms of the community, right? So they say they speak only of intellectual freedom, but they don't say anything about freedom from oppression. The writing that forges friendship and harmony between people and literature is Dalit writing, right? And he is the one who proposes new journalism as an option, and also that Dalit writers must write only for the Dalit masses, which earlier Kwanching had cited, because there is a purpose to it. There is some kind of mobilizing sort of purpose. So to sum up, the question of as far as the question of freedom is concerned, Dalit writing as a kind of claim on the public sphere, right? To make a claim on the world, to make a claim on the larger society, to make your presence felt, to cry out, saying, "I am also here," in a way, to struggle against this the neglect and the sort of blindness of society towards the problems of so on. So the ideas of freedom is also freedom from oppression is obviously the main thing, right? Economic and social oppression, the denigration of human beings, and they're putting them in a position of permanent degradation, etc. Right? But in the new domain, so what is happening is that the writing is in a way itself talking about the need for freedom, but is also in itself a kind of manifestation of freedom, assertion of freedom. That is, to say what you want to say, in that sense, So literary expression, but also critical expression. So in other words, there is also a inward looking thing. What is Dalit oppression? What do Dalits want? What change? Where do we want to go, etc. But also, what is the problem that we are facing? What is the kind of thinking that we are struggling against? What are we faced with in terms of the challenges posed by mainstream society to our society, to us as both people who are included but also excluded, right? That is the peculiar position of Dalits in society, is that they are not totally thrown away, saying we don't, you are not part of it. It's not that. They are shown a place. You are just outside, right? You are here. You are part of this in some way, but excluded from the center of it, right? There's the peculiar structure of villages, for instance, where there is a village and then there is a smaller village where the untouchables have to live, right? That kind of a structure, but the whole thing is called one, but it's in fact two. So to the extent that Dalit writing has any say in the spread of message, the ideas of freedom, I think, it's both manifests a freedom of thought in itself, because there are many different opinions, there are points of view. It's not that they're all saying the same thing. So there is freedom of thought there, the assertion of the claim on the discursive space, as well as a site, a means of exploration of the problems faced by Dalits in modern India, right? So there we are.
I found that today's article or topic is very interesting, very important. Actually, how to, from the very beginning, this thinking of the new discipline or to think of the methodology or theory in terms of how to comprehend the historical experience of or situation of a historical process, but also the area pretend social experiences. For example, body literature. That's very important. That is, but coming down to this very natural tendency toward standardization in terms of literary expression or ideological dichotomy or social class structure or the forms of inclusive exclusion. It happens throughout historical period of time in different forms. Caste and class, they are just different manifestations of this this inclusive exclusion. That inclusive exclusion oftentimes are established by the centralized power structure. It could be religious, but also could be a nation state. But also could be local tribal power center.
Right.
So the question would be how to, in terms of Rassam's concept, how do we establish new discipline? Of course, it's interdisciplinary, but also some sort of methodology and theory to make sense of this local historical experience or processes, and not to fall into Western disciplinary paradigm that easily. Okay, so that will mean, but not to he said we need a broad knowledge base. But so then that means on the one hand it means we need to maintain the tension between either this local knowledge or local historical material or experiences like that we, for example, we could observe from literature. But even literature, there are different kinds. There are maybe the subjective lamenting of the suffering or the social realism for one period of time, but in the same period of time or afterwards there could be this plea for effective detachment. So this seems to be even in one historical period of time, the literary expression, the forms of literary expression could be diverse and could be opposite. So we need to read both. We need to read those maybe very subjective lamentation of the suffering, which seems to be the same in each piece, but that also shows some sort of system that's inscribed in that either in history, in literary genre, or in that society. But so that we also can understand this the plea for objective or aesthetic detachment as a alternative voice in reaction against or in dialogue with that mainstream literature. So that the so-called Dalit literature or so-called this local experience, well, we actually need to read both sides or maybe different sides instead of just two sides of a literary form, so that we could read the forms of ideological inclusive exclusion, either through juridical form or through literary form, because in literature we really could see there's the hierarchy of the senses, the sensible, the affective structure, the hierarchy of or the affective structure of this abhorrence or and so on. Yeah, so that is something that I was thinking how to really theorize, provide a local theory in terms of comprehending the historical processes. That means not only these all different forms of historical materials, but also different forms of local history. But we read it positively and negatively. We read it from the surface, but also from the internal excursion from the surface. That's one thing that we're thinking of. The other thing is that the question of cultural conflict and cultural assimilation is something we also discussed in the morning in terms of Taiwanese colonial period.
Okay.
Yeah. Of course, the previous question that I was referring to also happened in Taiwan. That is a debate between social realism, the canon, or this modernist literature, and so on. So, but it's a lot. I don't want to repeat that. But this cultural conflicts or cultural assimilation through the historical process, especially with the colonial experience, when it is maybe unavoidable, maybe it's a historical coincidence, maybe it's a play of power by international forces, and then one country or one region fall into this colonial situation. And how do we deal with this historical past after that generation? So just like how do Indian people deal with this existence of past without ignoring it or effacing it or negating or disavowing it, but to reconsider the historical process, to acknowledge it, and to think the questions that's involved. So that's just two thoughts that occurred to me from your talk and Joan's comments. That also means how, for example, Taiwan literature. When we talk about Taiwan literature, Taiwan point of view, or the insights and so on, people tend to define it in terms of some sort of conceptual framework. But then that is just the questions we need to deal with to reconcile with the colonial experience or other experiences, including the martial law. And so, but to see other things that's emerging, that was emerging at the same time. So.
Well, it's a lot, yeah. I mean, the only thing I just want to quickly respond to is assimilation and conflict question. In India, one thing I would say is that I continue to think that there is some way in which I do think that caste is a social issue which has its own distinctive, it's a distinctive site of struggle. It's not to be
denying it. Sure.
No, I'm saying, no, in relation to Indian arguments, I'm saying Indian arguments, there is this whole debate between is it only social, is it class or economic issue and so on. My own sense is that it is social. Like, is women's that whole basic question, will women's oppression and caste oppression go away after capitalism is vanquished? This is a crude form of this. We all learn this question from so do you have to solve the gender problem and the caste problem and race problem separately, or will they all be solved if you solve the economic problem, right? This is the classic Marxist sort of question, right? Now, as far as that is concerned, I do believe it's a separate social question. When there is some way in which you have to deal with the specificity of that kind of thing, it's both a psychic reality, a social reality which has to do with community identities and so on. It cannot simply dissolve in economic change. But on the other hand, if you think about class as not just economic, but class also as a parallel social force, right? It's not, see, I believe the dichotomy between social is caste and economic is class is a false one. These are two social orders in competition. And as Pradeepan here says, is actually caste has its own economic dimension, and class system is not just an economic order; it's a society. So in that sense, it's a way in which the struggles which are actually class struggles of a modern nature for the constitution of modern society on a different sort of basis, in which the caste questions are entangled. So the caste problem in some ways has been relocated in a class context, in a context where the stronger dynamic is the dynamic of class. And therefore, what seems like a problem of assimilation and versus conflict is, if you map it onto this kind of thing, it begins to acquire a new significance. It's because caste conflict is essentially the older, more which prevails even today in the rural areas, where if somebody transgresses and violates a caste rule, the upper caste will just swoop down and punish them. That kind of older mentality of caste which is operating. But other than that, which is confined, as I said, to rural areas, in the urban domain, this is a peculiar way in which caste actually operates through the modern class sort of mechanisms, and therefore the conflict has to be rethought. Is the thing, it continues to be a site of conflict, but somehow there isn't clarity on what this means, because assimilation again is like that abolition problem, isn't it? What is assimilate with what? So in other words, it's a very interesting topological kind of problem, right? Topological problem in the sense that, so you have two entities. So one is big and dominant, one is small. So assimilation can be imagined as, the small getting absorbed into the big. But that is not, when you think about race or caste, this is not possible. In the sense, there isn't anything, there is no space, it's not that kind of thing. Whereas, in a historical sense, transformation which can be treated as assimilation would be that in which some new order which absorbs both is created, right? Effectively, that's the only thing you can think of, isn't it? So assimilation has no meaning, actually speaking, other than this historical change in which a new order simply relativizes the old things. So, they may continue to exist. The Brahmin and the untouchable and the other Christian and the Muslim may continue to exist, but whether this new thing is strong enough to relativize them, to make them into just recede, to make them into components. So, it is like there is this in India there are these wise men who used to be Birbal and Tenali Rama and so on. So, they used to always have challenges. Somebody would come and say, can you solve this problem? This is old stories. So, one of this problem, so one day somebody came and said, he put a stick there. He put it there and said, shorten the stick without touching it. Can you do it? So, this is, so it's also the king's prestige. If the king's wise man cannot solve the problem, the king becomes diminished, right? So, it's a prestige issue. So, Tenali Rama says, yeah, it's a simple thing. So, he says, you put a longer stick next to it, it becomes shorter, right? This is the thing. So, that kind of an idea, assimilation and all this abolition and all that actually have to do with that kind of idea, that there is a greater identity, a much stronger one, which prevails over those other things which you still retain. In the Hegelian sense, they don't go away, they are preserved, but superseded, right? So, that's the only way in which you can think about it. So, in fact, that a lot of in the Indian context, there is a lot of there is a total lack of clarity on that, and so I believe that issue, as it is raised in this text, is somewhat not well thought out. Yes.
So if we return to Pradipans,
yeah.
Yeah, because right at the beginning, it kind of talks about the vector of democracy and
Right.
in India, and how somewhat like what you kind of talked about, where in Kerala it seems like democracy has become that structure that has. I mean, it's ambivalent because you don't know if it has helped the past situation or it has not. Because he talks about
Kerala is a socialist government, right?
No, Kerala is this unique state where the first communist government was formed, but ever since then Nehru abolished it. He just dismissed it. But ever since then, Kerala has always had alternative governments. Congress, communist, Congress, communist, Congress, communist. Never has any government lasted for 2 terms. It's always, yeah.
Sorry.
But Kerala, so communists are a strong presence. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
No, because I'm thinking after reading this and getting a very great impression whether the caste problem has become better when these changes have happened, like democracy or modernization.
Mhm.
Or has it worsened?
Gotten worse.
Worsened the kind of in after these changes have taken place.
Right.
So I think it raises an important question to the processes of modernization and the kind of nationalist movement that comes into the fold. So
Better or worse is a very it's hard to certainly.
In terms of slavery.
No, slavery, yes. In terms of slavery, abolition of slavery. In fact, today the problem, the crisis that he is talking about, what is happening is Kerala labor is so well organized that they will insist. For instance, many middle class people, they complain. They say, supposing you want to move to Kerala, you take all your goods in a lorry and then you want to put it in the house. So you don't have money or you don't want to save money, you do it yourself. You are not allowed. The workers will come and say, we will do it and you have to pay us. There is no, you can't.
The union.
You know, it's very highly unionized and they will charge what they charge. You can't, very high rates of thing. That kind of unionization happened, and you can see also the quality of, Pradeepan's analysis. It's not, you actually think the Dalit writers also, those who come from Kerala, they are not, in other contexts, you can, Dalit writers are different. They are less conceptual in thinking, they are more, sort of protest language is more prominent and so on. You can, not in Kerala. There is, Dalit is not, Dalit intellectual in Kerala is in no way, inferior in terms of competence and so on. Because that is also, you have to see that there has been a tremendous kind of change in Kerala society. It has had the worst kinds of caste practices, but it has also had, in this modern era, a tremendous kind of, educational and social kind of transformations, which are reflected in the quality of, the Pradeepan or Yesudasan. These are not, in the discursive intellectual realm, they are not, in fact, they are not recognized as Dalit and therefore special case and all that. They are part of the mainstream. But they are talking about the caste question, it's there. But that is the thing, in that sense I would say it's better in some ways, maybe.
I have two, I don't know, one big thing, little thing. One is in terms of, there must be discussion on this sort of caste/class issue refigured in sort of Pierre Bourdieu sense. Sort of, how should I say, be conceptually put into the cultural, social, economic capital capability. So, including to explain, the formation of the Brahmin, and so on, historically.
You mean historically?
Both, right? I mean, in a way, Bourdieu says it's easier to explain, right, rather than dissolving. So so as you said, it's not only economic sense of the class. I don't know what.
No, I don't know. I mean, there are in fact, one of the things. In fact, I once commented to somebody that Indian sociologists have neglected, have ignored Bourdieu at all completely. There are a few, 2 or 3 whom I can think of who actually use Bourdieu in their work, but not in this way, actually. Yeah, and I agree with you. I think it's a very productive theoretical framework for because the Indian academic writing on caste is very much in the traditional mode. When they go on talking about caste as a tradition, caste as new, and caste as how to, the issues and things are very much conventional. There's been no change, except that one of the changes that's happened is precisely through Dalit studies, which brings kind of subjective critical dimension into the picture. So that then breaks the disciplinary boundary. It's no longer sociology that you're talking about, but more to do with that more intellectual discourse of a more interdisciplinary kind, which is involves critical reading. So humanities type of skills are involved, but talking about social issues and so on.
Another thought. Okay, the question is, I'm trying to see what can we learn from our side, not only the Dalit but also the caste. I was hoping Fred is here, readdressing. But let me try this out in this sense about individual issue. I don't know how when Basha, right, pronounced they seem to be accepted with the Indian studies, essentially individualist. right? Whether this arguable, or people who argue or not.
Yeah, of course it's arguable.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And because this is the issue not commonly addressed, right? Whether Confucius is an individualist, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I have this old friend passed away, Edward Chen. He's trying to say yes, Confucius thought is individualist,
Okay.
but not in the sense
In
of
the Western sense.
enlightenment and so on, right? And he used specific term, the term that he said this is the European sense is atomistic, atomic, individual,
Right.
right? But he says the Confucius notion is more relational.
Relational individualism.
Relational in the sense that the contemporary would be a teacher-student relation, or the king and the subject, 君臣是父父子子, father and son, and all that. So they place you. So last time I wasn't here. I mean, it's related to this very notion. For instance, how do you, merge these two systems together, right? Last time.
Yeah.
With the devotion or the service built into it, rather than saying this is a power relation, right? So in other words, I think in a way the Chinese individualism or social, if you wish, social role operates that. Confucius is nothing but that. It tells you what is your role you need to play, right? So this is not a power relation, right? This is a I don't know whether this is a useful way to suggest that. This is the assumption. How does the system work in terms of its thought? How would the untouchable accept? This is the service we need to provide, right? And also the trustee issue come into the picture, right? You provide service, we provide these welfare, to keep you, and this is all operating in the classical Chinese sense, within the family and so on, even until today. So, in other words, I guess I'm trying to suggest that all these issues practiced as a social system, caste order, become sort of, how should I say, the shadow of the system, rather than sort of, how should I say, there's another thing, the system operates in both structural way on the surface, but also beneath it. So in other words, still operate. Right? It's not like it's gone. But it's not an issue to the extent being highly contested, but it doesn't mean it does not exist. Right? So this is I don't know whether, so the classical hierarchy, classical order of things do not disappear simply, arrival of whatever you want to name.
No, sure, yeah.
Either you call status or class system, but still, as you said, this is social, but beyond that, it's more than that, right? So certain things get somehow transfigured into these. So I guess that's how I'm saying. I don't think looking at the Indian, caste or the Dali, because we also had it untouchable before, according to anthropologists. It's not like it didn't exist. But we need to think, even, for the contemporary sense, even within the family, right? Family structure, that's easier for us to think about, right? The relation between the father and the son, and all that. And was a sort of transfiguration into this situation. It's very oppressive. You hear all the stories, oppression to the extent something that we need to abolish the family, right? And so on. And some people would against it because it's one of the shadow, whatever. So I guess this is I don't know whether it makes any sense. You know, trying to.
No, see, I mean, Ranajit Guha, what he is actually saying in last week's, the reading which we did earlier, dominance without hegemony.
Yeah.
One of the things he is trying to say is this abstract theorization of encounters between ideas from the West and India, or something. They tend to see everything in terms of how much has changed, what has not changed, how traditional is it, how modern is it, and this kind of, sort of trying to calculate the relative things and so on. Whereas what he is, and so it remains at that abstract, the very thought is abstract. It doesn't have a grip on the actual given condition. That's what he's saying. The auto-critique that he proposes is actually trying to say that he's proposing that these two idioms are coming into some kind of coexistence. But this coexistence is not some kind of seesawing between one and the other. It's some unique combination that is generated. And so his whole point is that you are missing the uniqueness of this particular combination and how it operates on the ground, because you are concentrating on that story of progress. So even when you oppose the story of progress and say, you are still caught up in the same narrative, because you are simply reversing the sort of terms, right? So you are becoming arguing for some nativism, some indigenism, some uniqueness of this culture, and so on. So the challenge is to be able to see what is the distinctive formation in its own permanence. So the other thing is transition. Everything is transition from, it is going to become fully something. But in his reckoning, you have to see it as today, this is the permanent state of affairs. It may change tomorrow, that's not ruled out, but you can't simply treat it as a stage in some process, right? Now, coming to the Dalit question, as far as that is concerned, the issues arise within this unique situation only, right? So they are not actually raising the. So, for instance, the that earlier thing, the samskara type of novel, and all those other kinds of existentially, thought about caste, they tend to do that, right? They tend to think of it as a kind of the ego's sort of migration from one social order to another social order, or not even social order, from one social order to some kind of beyond society or existential freedom from caste and purification and so on. Whereas the Iyengar and these people, they are talking about a concrete situation, and in that concrete situation, what has new and in what way these elements are working together, how the idiom of one is being affected by the new idioms that are coming into operation, right? How caste is now continuing to operate as caste within a completely new sort of environment, right? In which you can't simply distinguish these things. And that's where I think it is a problem which very few, Pradeepan is quite, I think, interesting, because he tries to address that very problem. But often it is the case that people tend to simplify it, say that this is only social, it has nothing to do with the economic issues, it's not class and it's not something. and so on. Because is it different? Is it happening in villages only, or is it happening in the cities? What is the thing that's happening in the cities the same or part of the same phenomenon? All kinds of such things. The complexity, it's immensely complex. But I think the right approach, even if the gains are small, the right approach is this kind of approach, which says, what are the developments, how have they morphed, things, how have things become the same but slightly different, and located somewhere just off of where it used to be, right, and so on.
Can I push one step further? I mean, how in terms of knowledge, right? In the sense that we understand contemporary social science, is actually not able to tackle this sort of question.
Yeah.
Right?
No, exactly.
How do you tackle the ghost?
Right.
Right? We tackle these class, gender, and so these variable. We know how to do it. But all these ghosts are attaching to these variables. So in that sense, I think the class issue given us, so that the lesson is these things still operate. You imagine it's into different stages or different but it's there.
It's there.
Still operating without being able to account for, right? And so this is the challenge also on knowledge. How do you in this instance you can only read off from literary text.
I mean,
logically and so on. So I don't know. I mean, otherwise, how does that work?
My other question would be subsuming or assimilating this caste into this class and viewing it as a productive force in this economic structure. Would that avoid a new form of making a scapegoat or making a... So that would appear in all different social forms or social relations.
It will appear in all kinds of forms.
Yeah. And also this ideologically, you said this social issue, but that's also an effective or ideological form of exclusive. So if we acknowledge this economic group, if we take it, but can that effective maybe hostility could be really cleared away. Like in Japan, this the untouchable is also associated with this religious service and this the butcher and so on. So it's very difficult to get rid of that kind of making. So that comes back to a very basic question, that is a so-called religious taboo or religious separation from one small group of people in the society, and the rest will be this us or the society. It seems to be there. If we view it merely as a I don't know. There's people's effort. I think is very admirable. But could that really get away? I mean, from this basic? We could say it's a religious. It's not one religion, but it's that kind of a ritual separation or homosexual kind of issue.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that certain regions are isolated from the mainstream, right? Very much, this inclusive exclusion can continue in a unchanged form. There are places where, say for instance, just as in many Indian Hindu families, the fact that the law Hindu property law says that women, daughters should get property, is not, it is not neither it's not, sometimes it's not known, and sometimes even if it's known, it's not practiced. Nobody, does it. Because it just doesn't, the law doesn't penetrate into the household.
That happens here too,
Huh.
with the daughter's neighbor.
Right. You just don't. So there is a law which only prevails if you go to the court and claim it. It doesn't prevail as a social fact.
Yes.
So in other words, law is not society in the way that the coincidence of law and society. That is that the society itself is reconstituted by the laws that you adopt, as opposed to there being a society and then a system of laws which you can go and call for, you can invoke, right? It's that kind of a thing. You have so that means that the number of possibilities of variations is infinite. You can have different types. You can have those who tried to go to the court and failed, or their heads were chopped off, and those who actually went to the court and succeeded, those who want to but cannot, and those who don't even know about it. I mean, just
Not to mention the effects coming out of it. You take your father to the court, and
Yeah.
first they break up.
exactly.
You make them yourself.
Yeah. No, yeah. The concrete social problems of somebody who walks out of a family, where do they live? Actually, concretely, they don't have a society. Very recently, even I was having a conversation with my colleagues. We all of us in our it so happens we are all married in somebody other than our caste, right? Outside the caste. But the thing is, what we never realized, which is that the university provides you with a society, ready-made. Actually, you don't realize how traumatic it is for somebody to marry outside the caste and live outside, in normal social. They don't have anybody. Their neighbors are some other caste or something. It's not a social world that you live in. You just live in your house, right? Just you. This is the two of you. It's intercaste, but it's not. So the university and other kinds of public spaces, they where there are others like you who have also. It makes a huge difference to Otherwise, such marriages crumble. They just collapse. They just get isolated, suicidal, or bickering with each other. Something. The most intercaste marriages are dysfunctional. That is, they just collapse. Precisely for this reason, there is no society in the out there in which to live. Right? Yeah. So yeah, those kinds of uniquenesses, this way that law and society relate to each other, which is part of the singularity of your social order, and one can imagine that one can work towards a change, right? That is, you don't say that it's in transition and it will happen, but it may never happen. But you can work towards making it happen, and that's the only thing left. You can't refuse that option.
So you mean that intercaste marriage is not is a small number?
Very small,
Still,
extremely small to the population.
the right to marry, but
No, so intercaste marriages are, to start with, very small, and out of those, many are what you might call assimilationist marriages. In the sense that you may marry somebody from another caste, but they get drawn into that caste society. Upward or downward, whichever, but if it is accepted by the family, then the girl, for instance, gets absorbed into the boys' caste group. So it doesn't, come out into some new, seeking a new society. those out of those intercaste marriages, those who have to need a new society to live in is even smaller.
But I say the same thing, like arranged marriage percentage is very, very high, right? In South Asia, including Bangladesh.
Yeah.
But in our society, it doesn't work that way. But boiled down very, in a way, very similar, right? I mean, this 门当户对 business. I mean, you're married to the status or the family which is so-called compatible, right? It's not arranged, but your father would not agree. So that still exists. It doesn't mean it no longer.
No, that exists even in everywhere. America, Europe, also it exists. In the sense that parents are you have to like them. Otherwise you have to break away, right? In America, it's easier to break away in the sense there is a society where the context doesn't isolate you. Just for this reason, it may isolate you for other reasons, but just for this reason you don't get isolated. But otherwise, even there, the marriages are involve arrangement, the consent of other people, and what you can see that in the American, if you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, first you have to go and first your friends have to like them, or your parents have to like them, and so on. It's not totally complicated and